Hey, it's Kevin DeWitt here. Welcome to another plugin knowledge session. In this session, we're going to continue on with our Ozone 8 plugin suite tutorial, but we're going to look at the vintage tape module. So this module is obviously to emulate some vintage analog hardware taped machines, to give you some harmonic content, saturation, that type of thing. They claim that it is based on a Studer A810, which is supposed to be a fairly clean and accurate tape machine as much as it can be, which is very good for mastering. So they're trying to emulate all the good stuff of tape, but without all the bad stuff. So without the hiss, without the flutter, without the wow, all that sort of stuff. So let's just get into it and check out what it sounds like. All right, so here we go. We've got the vintage tape module open in Ozone 8 in Cubase. As you can see, I've got the full Ozone 8 version open with the module loaded here for consistency with the other videos in the series. As you'll notice, I've got the advanced version here, so I could load this as an individual plugin, but I've chosen not to do that in this instance to show it in this form. As with every other module that we have looked at, you can add, remove them. You can move them around if I had multiple modules and you want to change the order of the module chain. You can bypass it, enable it, you can solo it, and you can load presets just for this module. It's a fairly simple interface here. You can get obviously tape emulators that are quite advanced that have every little setting, every little detail down to noise and wow, flutter, hiss, the EQ range of it. You can adjust everything in some other plugins, but iZotope have decided to keep it fairly simple and just try to recreate the tape that they want to the best of their ability and to get what they want out of it as opposed to what they don't want out of it. All right, so going from left to right, we have speed here. So this is basically the speed of the tape, so they refer to these values as 7.5 IPS, which is IPS, 15 IPS, and 30 IPS, which IPS stands for inches per second. So that's the way they measured how fast the tape was going, by how many inches of tape would pass by per second. So obviously 30 is the fastest, 15 is middle, and 7.5 is the slowest. Changing this value here changes the characteristics of the frequency response and the sound that you get from the tape. So you're going to get different levels of distortion based on the frequency range, based on the speed of the tape and various things. The manual has a bit of a calculation here that talks about the wavelength equals the speed over the frequency. So their example is that a 500 Hz signal at 7.5 IPS will experience distortion at the same level as a 1 kHz signal at 15 IPS and a 2 kHz signal at 30 IPS. So for us that don't want to get down to the theory and the maths of it all, basically we flick through this and we just get a different character sound to it. And the way I've always seen it, whether it's right or wrong, is generally that the faster, the cleaner the signal. So for mastering, depending on, if you want to try to get a tape sound, but as clean as possible, I would go for 30 IPS. If you want to get that sort of, not vintage rock, but sort of a rock sound that you would get from the 70s, 80s, that sort of thing, you would probably go for 15 IPS. And then if you want to get a bit more sort of old school, a bit more distortion, drop down to 7.5 IPS. But we'll try that out in a minute. But whether that's accurate or not, that's the way I've always seen it. Unfortunately, even though I technically probably am of a generation that could have been using tape and would have been using tape, I didn't really get to experience that in my time in music, so I've always just dealt with it in plugin. And I'm happy that iZotope haven't put the noise component in this, because even when I use an emulator that has noise, I always turn it off because I don't want that noise. What I want is the analog characteristics of the tape, the gelling qualities of it, the compression, the boost to frequencies and that sort of thing, but I don't want hiss and that sort of rubbish if I can avoid it. We then have an input drive here, or the manual even calls it input gain, so they've reworded it somewhere along the lines. So this is just the input signal, and this is, as it says there in the pop-up, prior to tape emulation. So the higher we drive this signal, the more tape saturation we're going to get, the more distortion we're going to get. So we can adjust this to get the sort of impact that we want out of it. So it's, you know, it's almost like pushing the signal harder through a compressor, that type thing. So that's roughly what it's doing. It's just pushing it harder into the tape, and you're going to get more tape impact. Now, having not really been involved in tape too much, bias is one of those things that I've never really truly understood in great detail. I will explain what they state that bias does in the manual. All I do know is that it was a process that people used to have to do with the tape to bias the tape to get it to sound the way they wanted it to sound, or get it to sound as accurate as possible. But you could obviously over or under bias it to get different effects out of it. So the manual states that the bias primarily impacts the shape of the distortion curve, but also changes the frequency response, mainly the high end. Negative bias boosts high frequencies and causes more high frequency distortion than positive bias. High values of positive bias can severely limit dynamic range, a characteristic of overbiased tape machines. So we'll see what that actually means in the real world in a minute, but as it's stated, if we go into a negative one here, we're going to increase the high frequency distortion and in turn boost the high frequencies. And going this way, we're going to cause some more dynamic range limiting and probably reduce some high end as well. Harmonics here, they're stating that adds even harmonics into the tape distortion. So we'll hear what that does, but that's going to obviously add a bit more character and a bit more change in sound to what we get. So one feature of putting something through tape generally was that you would hear this boost in a low end. And what iZotope have done here is they've just given you a control here that actually it controls the resonant peak of the reproduced tape head bump. So it's going to, which level you have is going to add more bass heavy material or not so much. So we'll play with that one. And then we have this high emphasis here, which is supposed to compensate for high frequency losses in the reproduced tape head. So as a tape naturally, you can imagine, sort of rolls off the high frequencies here, we can then bring that back in if we so choose to with this high emphasis control. And that's the levels of the controls here. We don't have any adjustments or any other views here for the graphic display, but what we are going to see is a spectrum analyzer, which is probably the most important thing we want to see on a tape emulator anyway, because we want to see what it's doing. All right, so I'm going to bypass it now, and let's just play a song and have a listen, and then I'll just bring it in its default state here, and we'll see what that does. So I can hear a bass boost instantly there. a big difference in the bass elements there on the 15 IPs to 30 IPs. So my instant response to these three here without adjusting any of these settings is that the 30 IPs here sounds to me to be what I would call the cleanest, in that I'm hearing not a great deal of modification to the bass and high frequencies. There's a bit of a bass boost when we bypass it, but it's not massive amount. When we go to the 15 IPs, we get a bigger bass boost. Probably lose a little bit of the top end, but not a great deal. When we go to 7.5, that bass boost gets reduced again, but we lose a lot of the top end. And you can hear that by when I go between 7.5 and 30, the bass response on those two is quite similar. That's what I'm hearing in headphones. So just to clarify, I'm listening through some headphones at the moment because I'm recording this, so I may not be getting the full impact of what this is doing at a bass level. I haven't got a sub or anything going, so I may not be getting the full impact. So just keep that in mind when you're listening to this, because you may be hearing some things different to me, which is fine. You know, obviously let me know in the comments if you hear things differently and have a different opinion from what you're listening on. But from what I'm listening on with the headphones, I hear the bass response to be fairly similar between 7.5 and 30. But what I hear is that 7.5 is a lot duller. A lot of the top end frequencies are reduced. 15 is a massive bass boost there. So I just flick through that again. All right, so what happens if we drive this a bit harder? Now, I'll see, I might have to reduce the volume a bit, so I might do that first. So you can hear a lot of distortion there. So a very good way to destroy a song with the movement of one little control. All right, so let's now see what the bias does. So, you know, obviously you could go lower with the input gain if you wanted to. If you felt it was hitting the tape a bit too hard. Or if you want to just add a bit more. Okay, so you can hear when we go higher in the bias, they're positive. We definitely lose a lot of top end. Sounds very flat and dull. if we go negative, so it really depends on what sound you're trying to go for there. Right, so let's check out the harmonics. It's a bit like putting an exciter on, really, a very subtle exciter. And, you know, why wouldn't it? That's exactly what an exciter is to add extra harmonics to the content. Yeah, it's very subtle, and I'm guessing because it's even harmonics. But it does add a little bit of extra character to it if you'd like to use that. Let's check out the low emphasis now. So I've very reduced it. Still got a bass boost. Again, it's not as obvious as I thought it was going to be. Adds a nice bit of thickness when it's on the 30 Ips. I'll give it that. So it does add a little bit extra, but it's not as massive as I thought it would be for such a big move on a control there. It's quite subtle. Let's try the high emphasis. Again, seems very subtle. I guess you start to hear more impact with various controls together. Quite subtle though. And that's all of the controls we've got there. So just quickly, let's just flick through a couple of presets just to see what they do. So if you want to get some increased warmth, we've got a fair bit of drive, 30 Ips, bias is quite high, low emphasis is down a bit, and high emphasis is up. Fair bit of distortion on that one. Forward mids. They like to drive this input, that's for sure. Definitely brings the mids forward. As you can see, the presets are pretty overdone, so just keep that in mind. But it depends on what you're using it on. If you're using it on individual instrument tracks, that sort of thing, then it might be something useful to do this sort of level. But from a mastering point of view, I probably wouldn't go anywhere near this sort of these levels. So there you go. There is the vintage tape module in Ozone 8. Let me know what you think about it. Will you use it on your next mastering or mixing session? Do you like the sound of it? Do you think there's better ones out there that you would prefer to use as opposed to this one? Happy to receive any comments. If you're watching this on YouTube, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Check out the other videos, especially the other ones on the rest of the Ozone 8 plugin suite or anything else I've got on there. And feel free to check out my website for any other free content or paid content if you so choose. Hopefully it's been helpful. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.